Hey everybody and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about a very important topic that not only impacts the video games industry, but many other industries as well, and that is the issue of diversity in the workplace. More specifically, we will focus on gender diversity with respect to women in the video games industry, but we should certainly talk about other diversity topics in due time as well on future panels. But for today, to speak on this issue, we have three incredible speakers. First, we have Dr. Joe Twist, CEO of Yuki, the UK Interactive Entertainment, a trade body for games and interactive entertainment business in the UK. Secondly, Sam Wallace, Director of Executive Search Firm, Sheffield Haworth. And third, Linda Waste, Senior Director of Talent Acquisition, Inclusion and Diversity, and Employer Branding at Electronic Arts. Thanks very much for joining me today.
To be here.
Just to kind of jump right in, I thought we could start with this first topic, which is essentially, why aren't there more women in the gaming industry? And maybe we could start with you, Dr. Joe. What's going on?
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me on this. I think there's a number of issues that are going on that I think are sort of fairly well known. And I'm going to speak from a UK perspective, which is what I know best. I mean, first of all, we all know that making games and being in games businesses requires so many different skill sets, whether that be programming or business skills or art, so technical, creative and business skills, which are also technical and creative, the accountants will tell me. But, in the UK in particular, we haven't really had a very good track record of teaching computer science and programming and that kind of literacy at a young enough stage and also in a compelling way. And encouraging young people to get this sort of foundational computational thinking literacy so that they don't have these stereotypes about computer science or the kinds of careers that it can lead to. So I think there are some systemic problems just in the education system, and that may be different across the world. I know that we, in the early days, we ran a campaign to get computer science actually onto the high school curriculum. And, we looked at Israel and places like that where they were doing computer science really well. And I think critically in the UK and, likewise with other territories, combining that with art, humanities and creativity is critical. And getting the awareness of games as an industry, let alone as a career path, is so important. We at UK are doing loads of work in education. We run a 500 people strong video game ambassadors scheme. And we want to get as many different faces in front of people. We all know that kids kind of relate to different kinds of people with different stories and backgrounds. So I think there's an issue with the supply, of people coming through into our industry. But I think the industry is doing pretty well to try and address that. But that's number one. I'll stop there for a moment.
What about you, Linda?
I agree with the, especially when it comes into the tech hiring, it's surprising sometimes for people to hear how many kind of software engineers a gaming company needs. What percentage of our overall hires are actually in the tech space? It's quite a lot. And we in the US and in the UK, we haven't seen an increase in women graduating with these degrees, despite the pushes, all the things that both countries and many other countries, including Canada, where we operate as well. There's been a lot of work that's been done to try to get women, girls to stay in STEM and to go into these areas. And we still haven't seen the graduation rates increase by any significant amount. So there's definitely a supply problem, definitely. I think on the flip side of that, where we really have to challenge ourselves is in some of the legacy thinking about what do you need to have in your background in order to work in gaming? And first and foremost, if you start looking for people to fill a job and your first requirement is that they already work in gaming, you're kind of doing it wrong right from the start because you're working from a pool of candidates that's inherently non-diverse to begin with. So you have to start to think about relatable skills in other fields in order to try to bring an influx of different talent into the business. And by the way, that has incredibly positive knock-on effects with creativity and innovation and all the other things that are important to a gaming company.
Got it. And Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I agree absolutely that from a sort of systemic perspective, the getting the younger generation actively engaged in computer science earlier on is such an important thing, and it's something that I think across the UK as well as in the US, it's being there's more intentionality around making that happen, but it definitely means that there's a supply challenge coming in. And I think to Linda's point, there's this preconception that you have to have industry experience in order to be successful in the industry. And I think that can be off-putting. And so there's not necessarily the sort of looking up and across to gaming from women executives who haven't been in that industry. It's not a natural path necessarily. And so I think that that's something that needs to be addressed as well, which is making that something that is a decision that women can make and that doesn't feel unusual. Whereas at the moment, I think it feels like an unusual turn in a career if you haven't been there before.
Right. So it does sound like it's a serious problem, both, supply side as well as on the demand hiring side. And I want to actually maybe dig a little bit further on the hiring side in terms of, is there an unconscious bias in hiring or even in promotions? So just to kind of highlight the point that I'm trying to make, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Chamath Palihapitiya, who's like this billionaire investor, but he actually conducted a study on the venture capital industry that showed that there was, a lot of, white males in venture capital. There wasn't a lot of diversity. And so he himself kind of changed his hiring practices. In one of the interviews, he talks about how for his firm, he kind of changed the hiring practice so that you really couldn't see who the candidates were to kind of eliminate unconscious bias. And in fact, then he wound up hiring more diverse people to his firm. And so wondering if you guys could talk about this notion of unconscious bias, whether, and maybe it's just not even intentional, but that because there might be preconceived notions of the type of person that we're hiring for, that we may not actually be hiring against the specific skill that would actually allow the company to hire a better candidate or not. What do you guys think about that? Maybe starting with you, Dr. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, unconscious bias exists in everybody, and it's unconscious. And, that's the problem with it. And, in all walks of life, in all kinds of industries. And I would say, people have tried, that there's so many different kinds of unconscious bias training, or conscious recruiting, and I think it's very much about offering that guidance to companies. We this year, only this year, it feels like 10 years ago, launched our first ever census of the UK games industry, which is the first study of this scale. It's like 3,200 people who filled it out. And there were some really interesting findings in there, particularly around seniority of positions and age and demographics and social demographics. But I think the unconscious bias, it can be countered by sharing of best practice, by training, by highlighting them, making these things conscious. But companies need that guidance. And when we launched the census, we also launched a Raise the Game pledge, which has 3 pillars. And the first one is the guidance and really focusing on how do you widen your pool of recruitment. And again, that's like really, it's hard work to do that. And it can be difficult. But when you get it right, and when companies are given that guidance and you're learning from each other, it really, really pays off dividends. And I think that's really critical importance. And I think at this moment in time where we're seeing so many people, unfortunately, be hit by COVID in terms of their industries, unlike games, we've got so many potential women in particular who might have been displaced in other sectors like film or television or whatever. Mm-hmm. And actually, they've got so many of these skill sets. So I think there are different techniques, so long as you just don't leave it down to artificial intelligence, because we know how that ends.
An excellent piece of advice.
Mm-hmm. And Linda, how do you guys think about this at EA?
This is all I think about at EA, honestly. This is what I do. This is what I do for a living. And I'm very fortunate that when I came to EA earlier this year, even before kind of all the tumultuousness in the US around race and diversity, I had asked for this job. I had said, I want to do this. We have a huge opportunity here. We're not yet doing it right. It's a journey, and we're on it, just like a lot of other gaming companies and a lot of other companies all over the world, right? Mm-hmm. I think everything Dr. Joe said about conscious recruiting, I love the phrase conscious recruiting, by the way. I hope you don't mind if I borrow it. When I'm talking to people, I
probably stole it from someone else.
I think it's brilliant. We have to look at this. There's the only way to do this is to take a serious, long, hard look at your hiring practices and to think very, very consciously about what you're doing at every moment in the process where you're making a decision about a candidate. Is this candidate moving forward or am I passing on them? Why? We can't let people just use their gut, which is what happens because I think Dr. Joe said this, we're people. We are people. We have unconscious bias. We all do. And I tell the recruiters this all the time, like, what power you wield. You are the person who decides whether this candidate gets in front of that manager. And we were talking yesterday in a team meeting, and there was some stat that someone pulled, and I will admit that I don't know where this stat came from, but I believe it to be true. A recruiter might look at a resume for about 6 to 10 seconds before they make a decision on whether or not this person is the right person. Like, that has to change. Mm-hmm. And think about it. Maybe a manager looks at it for 10 seconds. So now we've taken 20 seconds to decide someone's fate on a job. That's human nature. That's not an EA problem. That's a human problem. Right. And we as companies have to solve that human problem. We have to educate people. How do you look at a resume? What should you be looking at? And how should you be interpreting that information so that you can make the right decision about these candidates? Where you're looking at applicable, relatable skills, not I've always done it this way, and this is the same job description I've used for the last 5 years, and this is what I need, and I'm not going to compromise on my requirements. Well, your requirements are biased, and they're full of legacy, and they often don't even relate to on-the-job performance success. So there's a bunch of things in the system that are broken that have to be fixed, and if companies aren't going to look at that, they're not going to have success no matter what pledges they make, public statements they make, how many people they're going to hire, what, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't matter. Don't care if you're not actually changing how you're fundamentally looking at your hiring process. So as you can see, I'm very passionate about this.
That's great. And Sam, from an executive search perspective, I know you guys are making very high level placements in the games industry, but is there anything that you can do, or are you getting clients who are asking you to also consider diversity?
Yeah, I mean, I think several things. And one of the things I'm really passionate about is thinking about the search industry's responsibility when we think about diversity, because what we rely on is the strength of our networks to be able to access the best talent for the work that we do. And if you take a rough glance at the executive search industry, particularly in the tech space, it's predominantly white men. And that's a big generalization. People might argue with me on that, but my view, predominantly white men, and they build their networks with people that are like them. And so the people that get the first call are people who are keeping that gender and that diversity imbalance in place at the top of the house. And so I think there's a place for female executive search leaders and just more intention within the search business to think about diversity. And it's definitely at the forefront. I think the conversation that we often have is that the intention is there, but the ability, sort of the emotional intelligence to get what needs to be done isn't there. So we get, clients will come to us and say that we have to have a diverse slate. That's an absolute. But then when it comes down to making a decision about diverse candidates, they're less able to find ways to make the different fit into the organization because they've hired in a certain way for the longest time, that then when somebody different comes in, they don't know how to either make the decision and take that uncomfortable decision for something different. And then the other piece is the assimilation into the business. They don't know necessarily how to make those people successful. And so there's sort of so much at the top of the house in terms of training and educating to think about how to make diversity better, easier for the organization.
Right. And maybe the next question I can ask you guys about is that, for example, we've talked about a potential supply and demand problem, but I think the other issue may just be having appropriate role models. And so when people are coming up in the industry, to have somebody to identify with. And so when we think about women in leadership positions at gaming companies, Sam, you mentioned there's a lot of white males there. What should we do, or how should we think about increasing women leadership at gaming studios? And again, maybe starting with you, Dr. Joe.
Well, this is, I think, quite a big problem when we looked at the data in the census, and it's a 62-page report available on Wikipedia.
I'll provide a link for people.
But what was really interesting again is this sort of retention problem. Full stop. 2/3 of the UK industry are 35 and under, which is extraordinarily young, and that they tend to be obviously in junior roles. And then when you look at it in terms of gender, it's really bad in terms of the senior leaders. And people talk about mentoring schemes, but I think sometimes people use mentoring as a blunt instrument. When I hear people talking about mentoring, it's often quite patronizing, and they're sort of sometimes. I love mentoring. I think mentoring is really important, but I think the way some people treat mentoring is quite patronizing and makes some women feel at the beginning of their career that unless they get mentoring, they're not going to succeed. And that's a narrative that I strongly push back against. I've had a library of people in my life that I pull upon and I call upon, and I'll shout and scream at them, and then I'm very professional on screen, But I think mentoring is important, but it's really that support and that the sort of friendship and other kinds of leadership support and training. And I don't think we're very good at that at the moment in the UK. And again, I think it's not necessarily the case. You've got to give people choice of people that they want to talk to get guidance. And I think it's champions. I prefer the word champions, people who champion you, or people who champion a particular kind of need to really make that change at the top. And that, we all know that organizations, the change needs to come from the top as well as from the bottom. When I joined Yuki in 2012, I had one woman on my board of 12 people. I've now got a board of 26 people, and it's more or less half male, female, and more diverse than it ever was. And that has taken a long time and hard work. But when you see those senior leaders around that, as the board of Yuki, representing diversity, representing different skill sets, different businesses, then that is inspiring, I hope. So it's a very complicated one again, but I think, mentorship or support programs, championing people always push back against lists. Why do we all have these lists of top 100, blah, 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 blah. But they're important. They are important because actually a good leader will look through those lists. We'll go meet those people. We'll try and reach out to them. We'll keep an eye on their progress. And actually they're really good, hot talent, so why wouldn't you have these lists and profile these success stories from women coming up the ranks and people who are already there? Siobhan Reddy in the UK is a fantastic role model. So are people like Debbie Bestwick. So the more that we can champion and the more that we can be champions for people, I think the better.
Linda?
Yeah, there's a lot there, I think, in terms of how we figure out, what the career progression is and the career advancement. I think you just have to be intentional about it in some way, shape, or form, and you've got to hold people accountable. So the idea that your leadership team is the one pushing all of this and they're modeling it, it's absolutely critical. I've gone over the course of my career, I've been in the advertising industry before the gaming industry, another industry sort of fraught with diversity issues, right? And I've seen a lot of strategies get, attempted for all of this, whether it's hiring or retention or promotion. And the one thing I think is really key is you have to look at the two things together. You really can't isolate these things. You have to look at representation as a company. You have to take a look at what is our current representation and where do we need to get? And then you take a look at those things together. You look at your hiring rate, your retention rate, and you hold managers accountable for both. One of the things that I'm sure happens to Sam, happens to me, it's like, we need more diversity. So, recruiting, go solve that. That's not going to solve it if you're not doing the things that you need to do to grow, retain, and advance the people that you have. So, having that intentional approach, knowing who those people are within your company that you need to be intentional about is really important. How many leaders actually know, like, these are the people that I'm keeping an eye on because, we've got the next time I have a job opening, I'm going to look here first before I look outside, for example. And we try to drive that in recruiting. We try to drive that conversation at the very beginning. Is there anyone we should be thinking about? Who should we be talking to? And we'll scour, especially when it comes to leadership roles at a certain level and above, we'll start talking to our HR partners. Who's here in the company that we need to be keeping an eye on. So I think that's incredibly important. And those role models are important. I'm really, we're very fortunate. And I say fortunate because we've had Laura Miele with us for 20 years now, our head of studio. But we were very intentional about putting her in that role. And she's run publishing for us for many years. And Laura is an outstanding studio leader. And that, makes a difference.
Tam?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's finding that balance between making sure that as executives who are coming from outside the companies come in, that they get to see some kind of gender representation across the organization. I think that's an important piece of an interview and selection process. The challenge with that is if it doesn't exist or it's created falsely, then you bring these people in, they have an expectation that they'll be working with a diverse group of people. And if it's been a little bit of a dog and pony show to make the experience real for the candidate, but it isn't realized when they get into the role, then that can be a real problem. I think one of the other things, so we've been doing some research in this space recently, and one thing that came up, and I think this plays into it, is the idea that if you haven't been in the industry, you can't be in the industry, which is a little bit sort of back to the topic we talked about before, but it's thinking about the gaming industry as analogous to film and television, right? If you haven't made a TV show before, then you can't suddenly get into TV. If you haven't worked at a gaming company before, you can't suddenly get into that. And I think that perception has to change. And again, that's going to be by bringing more diversity into the industry.
And it's such bullshit.
Right.
The most successful hires and the really scaling UK-based companies, you talk to them, and most of my team have come from outside of the games industry. When I joined, I thought this was a really weird term that people kind of said, "What's it like coming from outside the games industry?" And I thought that I don't hear this in other sort of sectors.
No.
But the most successful hires in companies, they are hiring producers or product managers who have come from other sectors.
Mm-hmm.
Diversity is two-dimensional. It's not just about who you are and who you represent, what you represent. It is also about your experience and your perspective. And that means if you've got someone who's dealt with, a number of different kind of sectors in product management or in a producer role, brilliant.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know when Linda and I were speaking previously, one thing you said, which I thought was brilliant, was like, there are some roles where you have to have gaming experience. Absolutely. And when you look at those positions, right, then there's a yes, you must have experience of a specific nature to do a specific job. But when you're looking at, let's just take HR, for example, what is it about HR that requires gaming experience? Now, you could argue the case that it does, but fundamentally, the skills of HR and managing an HR team effectively, it's not about the gaming. It's about the company. It's about culture. It's about all of those other really important things.
And so maybe speaking to this topic about role models, and in particular about getting women more exposure, for example, at talks, panels, things of that nature, I'm wondering if we could talk about that because, for example, I think that there may be an unconscious bias. And even with myself, like I'm trying to change in the sense that, a YouTube comment I got, like a few months ago was, hey, you never have any women on any of your YouTube videos. What's going on? And so then I had to think about, well, maybe there's something I'm doing wrong, right? And so I am trying to make a more conscious effort to think about it and to improve. But I also, just to be honest, I do think it is a little bit harder. I mean, not with the three of you, but just in general, trying to get, like, for example, like in some Slack channels I'm in, some guys could be talking about something, and I'm like, hey, instead of just talking about it, let's just jump on a video and talk about it. And they're like, oh, okay, yeah. But I think and maybe it's like the approach because it's too casual. It's just like, yeah, let's just go do this. But I do think for me personally, it has been a little bit harder. Not that it's not worth it. I think it's absolutely worth it to put in the effort and to think about it. But maybe we could talk about this issue of trying to ensure that whether it's a panel, a webinar, conferences, that women get more exposure to those things. What can we do? Dr. Joe?
Well, of course, it's entirely unacceptable not to be thinking about this. I'm not saying you.
No, I agree. I need to do a better job, 100%.
But I think, and I'm sure this is going to be echoed. I think a lot of people, and particularly women, are fed up of being the go-to token person who is supposed to know all the networks and doing your labor for you. I had a stand-up kind of shout at someone last year who is helping to pull together a conference by a legal firm, which will remain nameless. And, I pointed out, and so did several women point out to me, that the whole day of speakers they had one woman. And I said, well, it's legal. I said, no, that's not, this is an industry conference, not a legal conference. And so the person who was helping sort of came in with like a week to spare and asked me, he said, I don't know these women. I don't know the women. You know the women. It's like, whoa, this is not acceptable. I'm not going to do your job for you. I know the women, not because I'm a woman and inherently women magnetized towards women. That's not just how it works. I have gone out, I've looked at those lists, I've met those people, I've gone and tried to make, network. Mm-hmm. I have built my network up, and that's why I know them. So you go do that in a week, because I'm not helping you. And I didn't help them because, we cannot, and you hear this all the time, we know, even approaching women to be putting themselves up for election for my board. We all know the answers that people will give. It's the same with applying for a job and writing your CV or looking at a job description and going, well, I don't have 100% of that, so I'm not going to apply. We know that it's a well-trodden path. So it does take that extra mile to say, no. If you just pop onto this podcast with me now, it's fine. You don't need to, it's your very presence is brilliant. And the very reason I'm asking you is because you have a lot to say. So I think there's part that kind of, I don't want to stereotype women, but in my experience, there is still that sort of, I want to give you 100% to be on your panel or be on your board. And I can't right now. I've got too many other things that I need, like running my business. And then the other thing is the emotional or the labor that sometimes is overloaded on those women or other kind of people, diverse people who seem to be the go-to people. And they're trying to get their day job done as well.
Yeah. Linda?
Yeah. I have a lot of passion around, trying to stop the outsourcing of diversity to the afflicted populations. Let's go solve your own problem, ladies. This happens in the US when it comes to African-American, Black talent, Latinx talent. We have a particular unique mix of challenges when it comes to diversity here in the US, but it is this outsourcing, right? It's Dr. Joe, go call these people for me because you're a woman and you know them. Oh, let me go to my ERGs. They'll help me. Let me go to my recruiting team. It's your job to solve it. Oh, wait. Let me go to the D&I team. Like, what are they going to do for me? And at the end of the day, if you're a manager, you own it. And if you don't take responsibility for owning it and do what you're doing too, which is right, take a cold, hard look in the mirror. Like, I am a woman and I still have to, in the US, I'm a privileged white woman. So I have to look at my own place in all of this differently. I have to look in the mirror and decide what it is that I'm going to unlearn in order to be a part of the solution here, and that's what the process you're going through as well. And if managers don't really take that on, or if the leadership is not asking them to do this, and by the way, it's not just the ask, it's providing the tools. I think Dr. Joe mentioned earlier, training. We need to do both. We have to have respect for the fact that everyone's on a journey, and we have to provide them the education and the tools to think about things differently so that they can unlearn those things, those behaviors. But at the end of the day, what we've got to try to do almost, and I don't know that we'll ever get there, but there's a idealistic sort of future scenario where everyone owns diversity and you don't even need an outside diversity, a separate diversity inclusion team, because you've inculcated that thinking and that behavior and that expectation into your culture so deeply that everyone gets it. So that's that, to me, it really is, are you willing to, put your money where your mouth is and walk the talk by acknowledging your unconscious bias, respecting the fact that you're human as an individual, and that you wield great power when you make decisions about other human beings. And how you're going to show up in that moment, that's the real test of what I think a real true leader that's going to be successful in the future, by the way, because this is the way things are going. It might be slow. It might be hard. It might be a lot of us railing about all of these things. but I do believe this is the way the world is going. And I think those that don't do this will be left behind eventually.
And it's a really important point about, the sort of EDI is everyone's responsibility. I keep getting asked in my team, whose job is it, EDI? It's like, it's all of your job. But people instinctivly need someone to be leading that and sort of do. But it's like, I always use the analogy in the early days of my career at BBC, I was in like multi-platform commissioning, and digital would always be the thing that was tagged on, to a TV program, as opposed to thinking about it as a content experience and a concept, And so it's kind of like that, where I think we're slowly moving away from that. But that's how I see EDI as well. You still need someone who's going to ultimately kind of direct things and say, right, as you would as a manager, but it's everyone's responsibility, and hopefully, we won't need these titles.
I think to that, I'm sorry, let me just, and I'll stop. But I think to that, there's a role to be played in that education front. And I think that that's where we really need to focus. If your D&I programs need to educate people to do this work rather than do it for you. Yeah. And that's that at the end of the day, that's what your DEI or whatever you call it should be doing. As in addition to your recruiting team, like I look at our recruiting team and a talent acquisition, I tell people all the time, your job now is to educate. Give them the information so that they can make better decisions.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's such a key point is about having that information. So some of the research that we've done when we've been engaging talent, we look at how much time and how many points of contact we have to have with an individual to engage them and take them through a process. And what we found is it takes about 30% more interactions with female candidates to get them to the final placement. And that's a really important data point. And it's, again, this is sort of back to the point about training and educating. It's an important data point, because just because a candidate picks up the phone first and responds with a positive, yeah, I'm interested in that role, we're moving forward, that doesn't mean that we've spent enough time in the market to find all of the right candidates. And if we know that it takes that much more interaction to engage female candidates, then we have to educate the hiring managers and we have to educate the teams about the process and the time that it takes and the time that needs to be invested.
I also want to see, more kind of panels where we've got diverse people, but particularly women, not talking about talent and not talking about skills and not talking about diversity, but talking about business plans, talking about projections, talking about, really hard business stuff. Again, I sort of I didn't shout. I do shout sometimes, but I didn't shout at this person, but I really railed against this conference organizer who said, oh, well, Joe, you can talk about skills and talent. And I said, are you saying that because you think I'm naturally a nurturing person because I'm a woman? And that might have been my own bias coming in. But my counterpart in another trade body was there to talk about tax relief and scale ups and business. And I'm like, I would rather talk about those things, right? Why? What's the basis of the decision? Because we have so many more programs that are doing that and blah, blah, blah. So, I'd love to see it. It's like not even acknowledging that actually this happens to be an all-female panel and we're talking about really hard-hitting business issues. It's that kind of world I want to see.
Yeah.
I do think that the education piece could be very valuable. So even in my case, as I mentioned, it required somebody to like call me out to then make me think, oh yeah, actually, I'm not thinking about it enough. And I think, especially if you are if you're organizing a big conference, or if you have control over a platform, like maybe not so much the YouTube channel, which is more niche, but the Deconstructor podcast reaches a large number of people and is very influential. So I think to the extent that if you are in one of those positions, having that education so that we think about the responsibility that we have, I think that would certainly help. And at least it has for me.
I think the power dynamic, it's about power, right? When you have reach, you have power. When you are a manager, you have power. When you're a recruiter, you have power. Like we talk about this all the time when it comes to all the isms that come into play in the recruiting process and all those unconscious biases that come into play. You have a responsibility to, again, take that look in the mirror and really decide how you're going to show up.
Right. And now kind of shifting to a potentially sensitive topic, I wanted to talk about What I'm sensing is kind of a politicalization of diversity, and this kind of takes the form of like this is just my own opinion, but what I sense is kind of anti-woke messaging and to some degree movement against political correctness and sensitivity and movement against cancel culture. And again, not to get too political, but it's also, in my opinion, to some degree, also manifested in support for, President Trump. Whether you're pro against President Trump, but he kind of represents, in my opinion, a shield against political correctness. So, I wanted to I want to hear your opinions in terms of what you would say against the people out there who would argue that the movement for diversity has gone too far. And this, again, in my experience, I'm kind of sensing this kind of anti-movement as we're trying to also now broaden the message about diversity and that kind of thing. And so I guess two questions. One, are you also sensing a similar movement, or is this just me? Because I'm also just like hearing from folks, and I think I mentioned some of the comments before we start recording that I'm hearing. But then, how would you respond to the anti-woke movement? And starting with you, Dr. Joe.
Block and move on. Block and move on. Honestly, I mean, I think this is the world we live in. It's great to see people being far more politically engaged than they ever were. I did worry in 2016 with the American elections and the referendum in the UK that people might just not vote anymore. But I think people have been much more politically active, which is fantastic. We have social media, we have these platforms that really amplify these voices. But you know what? I learned a long time ago not to delve deep into that murky world. And I just do what I do because I know it's the right thing to do. And I know we're not on equal footing. We don't even have equal pay. We are not on the right footing. We know that the creativity and diversity is the absolute engine of innovation, right? And we know that that comes from diverse representation. We know that our products, our games do not even, we've got a 3 billion global game playing audience. But what about the whole African continent? What about the whole of the Indian continent? What about the absolute potential for wonderful games to be made in those territories, in those places? We do not have equality. I will block and move on if anyone thinks it's gone too far. That's my view.
Well, I think I kind of alluded to this earlier. I think those individuals will be left behind eventually if they hang on to that antiquated thinking. There is, still a serious amount of work that we need to do. And when we look at something like, who plays our games, for example, at EA, when I joined EA, I was talking to my family and I realized that my dad was on one of our platforms with Pogo and he's like 78. And my son, who was 16 at the time, was playing NHL and, other games and Star Wars games. So even in my own family, there was this incredible range of age diversity, in our players. And we have to produce games that are engaging for them, that feel safe for them, that are creative, interesting, that speak to them. The world that people live in when they're in their games needs to reflect, what's motivating for them and exciting for them and engaging for them and inclusive for them. And if we don't have employees working on those games and developing those games that bring this different thought and experiences to the table, we won't deliver for our players. And at the end of the day, it's a business imperative. And the numbers are very clear. So I can't even accept the notion that we've gone too far. This is the last gasp, right? And I think about this politically, and I tell myself this, and perhaps it's because I have this idealism that I'm stubborn about. But even in the United States with the election and the fact that, I still have to grapple with the number of people that voted for Trump. It still shocks me, it amazes me that 71 million Americans actually thought that was a good decision. But I do feel palpable last gasp of this mentality. This is people who are afraid. When you're saying that this has gone too far, it's because you're afraid of losing power. You're afraid of not being in control anymore. You may not identify it that way consciously for yourself, but somewhere subconsciously, fear is the motivator for that.
Sam?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's not a lot more to say, is that, I mean, it's sort of like we haven't gone too far, Linda, to your point. If people think that they will be left behind, I mean, there's just so much more work to do. And it's work that's not about fixing the women. It's work that means creating a platform for greater equity across all diverse aspects of society. And I think that has to be deliberate and it has to be worked at, and we have to keep pushing that. But I think to engage with people who say it's gone too far, it's not a good use of time, because there's more work that we have to do to make change happen.
It's worth reminding those people that inclusivity means inclusivity. So it's not at the expense of excluding, white boys or middle-aged white men. The experience that a lot of men in our industry have had, because they were, as well as some women, but not enough, but, there are men and women who've been at the beginning of our industry, we're only 40-something years old, and they're still alive. It's amazing. So, that experience is incredibly important. So inclusion is not at the exclusion of everyone else.
Yeah, and I would say that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just going to add to that and say that, when we really truly have inclusive environments, everyone benefits. Everyone benefits. It is like all boats rise, right? We all get better together. So it is not to say we're taking over, screw you, we're leaving you behind. It's, hey, guess what? If we do this, we all have a better work environment. We get better benefits. Guess what? The white men benefit from that too. When we have more inclusive benefits that are more diverse and allow for more ways of living your life, that everyone benefits. We don't have to have this cutthroat culture that we used to have.
Right. I guess the other thing that I wanted to try and highlight was that, so there's the one issue about, has diversity gone too far, which I think when you really look at it, it's like we obviously have not gone too far. But then the part that I'm more afraid of is if this issue of diversity gets politicized, then just looking at where we are today, as soon as issues do get politicized, then everything becomes like, right versus left, white versus black. And it's very hard to have a discussion, because then everything just gets so sensitive and people.
But that's why that's why I think I would say that places like Twitter are not the places for those discussions. That's where, working groups, where associations, where, having constructive conversations is the place to have that. It's
right.
not on social media, I'm afraid. That's my view. I listen to I listen to opinions, but you can get, as I say, down a rabbit hole and in a quagmire.
Yeah, I'm terrified of Twitter personally.
I don't spend much time there. I think that how you talk about diversity, and how you sort of, I think I mentioned this earlier, it's really, for me, it's been about how do I respect where somebody is on the journey without totally giving into them and accommodating, their point of view, right? Because, my role is to educate, and everyone I meet that comes into, like, I run our hiring training, for example, and everyone that comes into those sessions with me is coming in with their own life experience and their own education on the topic up until that moment in time. And it's my job to take them from that moment in time to a further moment in time where they're more educated and can go out in the world a little bit better prepared. But I do have to have respect for where they come in at. And if I just start by saying, bad white men, then you're right. We have this conversation where everyone gets polarized, It's hard to do sometimes, because sometimes there are things that people say that, quite frankly, are rage inducing. And, I really want to go like, what is wrong with you? But I have to go, wait, stop. My job is to educate. My job is to bring people with me on the journey so that, our company is a better place for all of us to work, But it can be, if you start to, when we start to put out things like, we're going to hire X number of more this population by this date, then people start to go, oh, that means at the exclusion of someone else, or it means they start to interpret what those things mean. And I think you have to really connect the what with the how to help everyone understand that like all the things we're saying, it's not at the exclusion of everyone else. It's not to say we're not hiring white men. It's not that we're lowering the bar on talent and we're now going to hire B players because, oh, women couldn't possibly be A's. You know, it's a whole perspective shift along with the education and the tools to look at things differently.
Mm-hmm.
Ma'am?
Yeah, I mean, I think the observation about things being right or left or being very politicized, I think that's a present day moment because of the outgoing president. And I think that that is going to start to change over the coming months, where people will say, you know what, we can have conversations. This isn't a black and white issue. This is something that we can engage in a debate. And we can agree that we have different points of view. And I think at the moment, people are just really so firm in their views that there's not a willingness to hear the other side. And I think that's sort of what you're alluding to. I think that's, like I said, I think that's as a result of where we are with the administration. And I'm optimistic that as we move forward, that's going to change and people are going to start to want to educate and engage and have more discussion.
Great. And just to talk about even more sensitive topics in terms of my next question. So I wanted to talk about the issue of potentially harassment and discrimination against women in our industry. And is there, in your opinion, do we have a unique problem? Because when I think about some of the incidents that have occurred in the video game industry, whether it's Gamergate or there have been a number of high profile incidents, especially with like gaming influencers, and, you know, and not to get super sensitive, but there are a lot of rumors, and I'm not going to mention any names, of leaders at various very high profile gaming studios that kind of seem to indicate that there is a problem with discrimination, harassment against women in our industry. So I wanted to, you know, turn it over to you and get your perspectives in terms of whether you think there is a problem, how big is it, and then what can we do to try and address some of these things that might be a problem. And starting with you, Dr. Joe.
I mean, look, this is not something that is unique to the games industry. I've been in many different roles in different industries, and you know, you see it around everywhere. And I think it's getting much more. I think in terms of games, again, I think part of it is that we live on social media in the games industry, and so a lot of the stories are amplified, are there, are present, they're in the public immediately. And I think we have to be really careful about rumors versus what we know. And I think this is not something that's unique to the games industry, but I think we have unique characteristics within the games industry and the way that we work that may amplify this as an issue. And I think that's a good thing, and that we're hearing about stuff. And, you know, in the UK, the second pillar of the Raise the Game pledge is about workplace culture. You know, we have different employment laws throughout different countries, and harassment and discrimination is against the bloody law where we live, you know, and it's completely unacceptable and it should not happen. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So I think, again, that's a leadership issue of taking a responsibility and making sure. And sometimes, even when you think things are going really well and there's no such problem, you as a leader have to pick up those stones and turn them over. Because you will find shit under those stones, unfortunately. And that I think the industry beats itself up a lot about it from where I sit. But I think we have to recognize that this happens in other sectors. And actually, I'm very relieved to be in the game sector compared to other sectors that I hear even more horrific stories from.
Linda?
Yeah, there's no doubt that it happens, you know, and because, again, I think we all know that it happens in every industry. So why would gaming be any different, right? And I agree with Dr. Joe that, you know, there's a unique environment with gaming in general. And I think it sort of permeates the entire experience, whether you're working at a gaming company or whether you're actually a gamer and you're online. You know, we all know about the harassment that women face online and have faced for years in the games themselves. And that sort of seeps, that sort of, the two are like interdependent and interconnected, right? The people that work at the companies and what's happening in the games. You have to kind of, you know, look at that as you've got to solve the harassment in game. It's not just, you know, to me, it's not just, you know, how you show up as a company and what you're doing in your company. It's, you have to believe that people shouldn't be harassed in general. you know, and for things, and you have to control that as well. And it creates a huge problem for us when it comes to recruiting, because it creates a negative impression of the industry. So all of the sort of toxicity in games can lead to a problem when you reach out. Like Sam mentioned, you have to spend 30% more time with maybe a female executive candidate. Well, there's a reason for that. There's a hesitancy when you reach out to someone. I had this hesitancy when I got the call to talk to EA. I was like, ooh, gaming? Like, I don't know. I don't think that's a place that's welcoming for me. And it took some conversations. It took quite a few conversations for me to start to go like, oh, okay, this is a gaming company that I can get on board with. And I think they're doing the right things. You know, again, we're on a journey just like everybody else, but it is an inhibitor to, you know, we don't have a great brand like industry image when it comes to just reaching out to women and saying, hey, you want to work in gaming? The initial reaction is, I don't know, right? Let me think about that. The initial reaction isn't like, yes, absolutely, I'm dying to work in gaming. Unless you're already a gamer, then you might say that, right? So it's a huge problem for us when it comes to attracting more women. This is the beginning of the topic, like why aren't there more women? What's getting in the way? That's the harassment, and the stories about harassment are definitely a barrier.
Yeah, I agree. I think as Dr. Joe mentioned, like harassment isn't unique to the gaming industry, right? It happens across all industries. I actually think one good thing about the sort of high profile nature of some of the incidents that have been reported over the years is that it's shining a light on it. And it's actually forcing companies to say, you know what, this is about creating a culture that people feel safe and where behavior which would be demeaning or harassment is unacceptable, and there are consequences for it. It's not just something that gets kind of, you get told off and then you carry on doing your work. There are consequences, and there's training and development that go around it. I think that's really important. And I think the other thing, Linda, to your point, is about how people identify gaming and sort of the preconceived notions they have of it. And I think, you know, my experience of working with female executives in the gaming space and trying to attract new talent in is that there's this perception that gamers are the teenage kids in their room and they're kind of plugged in, and that's what gaming is. And yet that's so wrong. And I think it's important to, again, back to the education point, educate women and diverse talent about what the gaming industry is and the complexities of it and the nuances of it, because it isn't the stereotypical image that I think people jump to as the first place to go.
Right. And Sam, to your point about shining a light on the industry and having improvements, I think that one good success story would seem to be Riot, and they brought in Angela Roseborough, their chief diversity officer, and it seems like there have been, in some cases, a problem. The problem seems to have been addressed, and there's improvement. So, to your point, I do think that one good thing has been highlighting the problem, and hopefully that will lead to better outcomes. And so, I wanted to talk about that. What can we do as a game industry, as leaders in various game studios? What should we be doing, and what are things that have worked in the past to help improve the situation? Again, starting with you, Dr. Joe.
Well, I think it is about the second pillar, which is, creating that inclusive and welcoming workplace culture. I think having policies that are really clearly laid out in plain English and values as a company is incredibly important. And advertising not just digitally, but in your actual office. This is not acceptable. In the UK, you walk down a train station, Paddington Station, or you go on a bus, when we used to do that kind of thing, and you see these signs everywhere that is, we do not tolerate abuse to our drivers, and to people who work here. And it's like, that is public posters. So I think, making your values and sort of having your policies in place is incredibly important. I think one of the issues that we see is, and I mean, there's so many when it comes to this kind of thing, but we have a lot of small and medium companies, people with companies with 10 people or less. They always look to us at Yuki. They're like, do you have a ready-made HR handbook? Do you have a policy that we can adapt or adopt? Because they don't necessarily have in-house HR. They don't have these kind of support mechanisms. So again, sharing good practice policies. Here's the BFI and BAFTA worked on anti-bullying and harassment principles for all companies to adopt after the Weinstein moment. And, equipping companies, no matter what size they are, with the clear policies. When I was at university, I was doing my PhD, and I actually, this was in like 1998, 99, must be 98. But I was being sexually harassed at the time by a fellow student, and it was in 98, remember? So, you know, he was actually sending me photos and really weird physical mail. You know, that's not how, it was very strange. Anyway, I sort of took it very lightly, and it was actually my supervisor at the time. He said, I sort of joked about it and showed him these pictures, and he was absolutely appalled. And he encouraged me and supported me to take this to a further. And actually, the good thing was, even in 1998, the university had a sexual harassment policy. They had a complaints procedure. They had a very clearly stated, this is what's going to happen. And I felt supported, and I could do it, and it was a good outcome. And I think that's one of the big issues, is how we help people in the company to feel supported, to have those policies in place and clearly advertised. It's not always the case. And I think what's happening in the States with, you know, we're looking at, should there be another kind of form of sort of legal advice hotline in the UK? Because I think that's really important. If you can get free, objective legal advice, rather than feeling like you might have to go and speak to the HR manager or someone in the company who happens to be best mates with the CEO, that's not going to make, that's not encouraging trust and a good culture. So it's complicated is the answer.
Linda?
Yeah, I think it is really complicated. You know, the few thoughts that I have on this is that, you know, if you're an industry leader, executive leader in any way, somebody with any kind of power, you know, I think you have to, you know, you've got to, first of all, believe that there's a problem to be solved. You know, there's got to be a belief in place, because otherwise you're just giving lip service to something for political reasons. You talked about the politicizing of this whole issue. It becomes politicized when people say, oh yeah, I'll go speak at that conference and talk about how important diversity is to us. But at the end of the day, I'm not really going to empower my HR team to conduct an investigation on sexual harassment. I'm going to, you know, I'm best buddies with my HR director, for example, right? You can't behave that way and expect to make any changes. And so I think, you know, you talked about this earlier, like where there's, you know, maybe a wave of kind of a pendulum swinging, you know, and I think those pendulum swings are going to keep happening. And I think we're going to see that happen until things sort of settle out a little bit. So I think, first of all, you've got to believe that, you know, there's a problem to be solved. You have to kind of pause and question your approach. You really have to have that vulnerability as a leader to say, maybe they're right. Maybe I need to look at this differently. Maybe I need to take a step back. Maybe I need to listen to the experts. Maybe I need to listen to my HR team. Maybe I need to listen to my recruiting team. And if you've got the right experts in place, allow them to do their jobs, and allow them to do their jobs as an independent body that gives you consultation and advice, and not a service that's in your company that you go tell them what to do. Because there's a real danger in this sort of service mentality ticketing system when it comes to your recruiting team, your HR team, your employee relations team, your benefits team. You want those teams to be experts, and you want to allow them to do their job, because we have an expertise that we can bring to the table and we can help, but you got to let us sit. You got to let us in, and you got to believe that we have the expertise to help you.
Sam?
Yeah, I think sort of to further to that point, Linda, I think it's also recognizing that there has to be an investment in this from organizations. It's one thing to say diversity is the top priority for us. But then if you break that down and say, well, what investments are you making in this? What are you going to be held accountable to? And what are the consequences if you don't make that happen, right? If none of those things are really put in place, then it is paying lip service to the topic. And I think that's a really dangerous thing, because people will hold themselves up, or companies will hold themselves up as leaders in diversity. But unless there's that commitment, financial as well as outcome based, then I think there's some issues. The other thing I think is recognizing that there is no band-aid solution to this. So once a problem is identified, to hire a chief diversity officer and say, job done, we've got it sorted, that doesn't solve the problem. It's a journey, because you have to then unpack the problem and recognize that it's the proverbial peeling the onion, right? Once you've identified one thing, you just can keep going deeper, and there's just so many different ways to make improvements. And I think it's recognizing that, you know, even when big hires are made that show an investment in diversity, they are then going on a journey themselves. And I think that has to be supported through financial commitments and as I say, the outcomes.
And just like with peeling an onion, there will be tears.
Right.
Absolutely. And that investment is a time investment as well. You know, we often go to business owners and say, I don't need money from you right now, but what I need is 3 times more hours looking at resumes or screening candidates, because if we're really trying to do this and screening candidates in, for example, I need you to talk to more people, because you can't judge them just by a piece of paper or resume. You know, I'm going to need 3x the investment in recruiting. Yeah. So there's those things as well that managers and leaders can do outside of just financial commitment, but both tend to be important.
Yeah. Well, and back to Dr. Joe, your point about the lists that we keep in the industry about who is up and comers and who's at the top. It's also finding the time and making sure that leaders invest time in getting to know those people. You know, some of the projects that we get involved in are simply to do market mapping, find, 5 amazing people a month and have the CEOs meet them so that they know who's in the market, not because they're hiring for a particular role, but because they want those relationships and they want that network. And that's awesome work for search people, because we get to connect great people and not have to focus on placing someone. We just kind of build the relationships. But I think it's that level of intention about who do you know? How do you know them? Do you have a real relationship with them, or did you just exchange business cards and so now they're in your network? What's the value of those relationships? So it's sort of the informal coaching or championing or mentoring, or all of that is sort of that investment of the stuff that sort of sits off the side of the desk. I think it really needs to be made.
Yeah. And I think that at the end of the day, here's what I'm seeing as a recruiting leader in this industry. Candidates are really a lot more savvy, and they don't really look at this as the company having all the power in the relationship when they're interviewing. A lot more candidates feel in control of that situation. So we have this sort of mentality that we hold all the power when we're hiring. Like, hey, try to impress me, candidate. It's not the case anymore. Super savvy candidates. They're asking really savvy, deep questions about these topics of their companies. They're evaluating your values as a company and the work you put out in the world, and not just what you're saying, but what you're actually doing. They're asking our recruiters some really tough questions. So you know what? At the end of the day, if you decide that this isn't your thing and you don't really believe there's a problem and you think the pendulum swung too far in this diversity space and that, we're overcorrecting, cool. Guess what? You're not going to get your fair share of the best talent. You just won't. The companies that do make these changes will.
Right. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. Those are all the questions that I have. Just kind of to wrap things up, maybe you could also talk a little bit about like if you have a final message to the audience, and then if people are interested in getting in touch with you, how could they do that? And maybe starting with you, Dr. Joe?
Sure. I mean, I think that, we've covered so much material here. We know that this is a business and a moral and just a human imperative. Exclusion shouldn't happen, and difference is critical to community, to everything that we do. You can get in touch with me through joe@uki.org.uk.
Great. Linda?
Or you can follow me on Twitter, so long as you're not. Otherwise, I'll block and move on.
Look, I think, again, so many amazing topics. I think, at the end of the day, you have to really own your part in the process. And, we all have a part to play. And, building your own emotional intelligence around this is something that whatever industry you're in will only benefit you in your career, I think, in the future. You can get in touch with me on LinkedIn. That's where I'm posting these days, and the best place to find me. I am on Twitter, but I only follow hockey teams on Twitter, so don't follow me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of echo what Dr. Joe and Linda have said. I think it is about recognizing that we have to be deliberate in these conversations, and that we have to influence and engage and educate to start to make a real difference. And it's not a moment in time. This is ongoing in order to get to a place of change that we want to. And I think that's just going to be an evolution. And it's such a big topic. We've talked for an hour and we've kind of scratched the surface of what can be done and how things can improve. So I think we need to continue having these conversations as well. And same for me, LinkedIn, best way to reach me.
All right. Well, thank you very much again. I really appreciate this conversation. It's definitely a conversation I personally needed to have, and it was very beneficial for me. So again, thank you very much. And that's it. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.